Well, the state of the world is a big question that would take more than a couple of minutes to answer. I think, though, that if you look at the ambience of the world, the way feelings will be, I think that on net balance, we're every year getting more and more, better and better for more and more people. Starvation is less important than it has been. Infectious diseases, contagious diseases are becoming more prominent in our thinking and under better control. What's happening is we're moving toward a westernization of large parts of the world that previously had been relatively low income and hence limited in the benefits of ordinary people. You have both India and China moving at very, very rapid rates out of being second-tier countries to becoming first-tier countries, economically, politically, culturally, and so on. Now, that's not all happening at equal speed everywhere. The situation in sub-Saharan Africa, aside from the Union, is not at all good. There's mixed situations in South America, but on net, everything's getting better and better for more people than ever before. Democracy is a very interesting question. There's no doubt that Western Europeans, New Zealanders, Australians, Canadians, and Americans see democracy from a relatively narrow framework. They see it as evolving basically out of English experience, going all the way back to the Magna Carta. They see it, of course, crossing the Atlantic, being very prominent in the colonies and in the other former colonies. And hence the belief, the feeling, the deep-seated belief, is that democracy is only real if it's representative in the sense of a parliament or representative in the sense of an elected system, like in the United States. I think that's not going to carry all around the world. Fundamentally different cultures, Islamic cultures, Oriental cultures, Chinese, for example, Indonesian cultures, they are almost sure to evolve versions of democracy which flow out of the culture and which, in some sense, share a central characteristic. The central characteristic of democracy is not a parliament. It's not even having elected officers. The central characteristic is that there is a mechanism whereby the people can express their feelings, their judgments, their hostilities, and their wishes, and with some confidence expect that the governmental apparatus and other institutions will respond to that in positive ways. Now, the problem, the specifics, getting down to the details, is what could that mean in an Islamic country? What could that mean in a black African country? What could that mean in Chinese culture? So I think we have to expand our sense of what democracy is and then look at how to promote it against those cultural backgrounds. The key word in what you just asked is the word remain. They remain because they're still what needs to be accomplished after 2 or 3 or more hundred years of accomplishment. We've widened the constituency of voters, ex-slaves, women, all kinds of people are now actively sought out as voters because we've expanded the base of that. The prosperity of the country has, aside from occasional recessions and 1 or 2 significant depressions, the United States has continually moved ahead to be more and more prosperous for more and more people. As a nation based totally on immigration and immigrants, the story is virtually universal. One generation arrives impoverished, escaping from the hellish world of Europe or elsewhere. They come here, and by the time their grandchildren are around, they're totally assimilated, totally Americanized, and probably making more money and enjoying more benefits than they ever dreamed of. pay attention to the trends, to the people who are still at the perimeter. And I don't mean to say that it's significant, either insignificant, either socially or politically, but those numbers are relatively small. And in some cases, the problems seem to be intractable, such as the urban ghettos or the rurally impoverished areas. But that's because we haven't yet been innovative enough about how to reopen a world of opportunity to those people. And it's going to be primarily through education. It's going to be primarily by widening their horizons. So I think if you keep the key word remain in mind, you'll see that there's a way to go, but that no way is it a desperate situation. The question you raised immediately brings to my mind all the Christian missionaries who scattered into the world as we are in the earliest stages of globalizing, with the expectation, the firm belief, that once we Christianized the heathens, everything would be great. And of course, what we learned is, first of all, you couldn't Christianize all of them, and secondly, those that were not particularly better off. And that's an example of you can't deliver prepackaged democracy or prepackaged economic theories or prepackaged ideologies to people and make them or have them or force them or cajole them into adopting them. And so we see a similar thing happening today as the United States, either militarily or through assistance, moves into other countries and expect to democratize them by, in some sense, making them mimics of the American system. And that just simply can't work. If you look at the situation in Iraq today, three strikingly different groups slammed together at the end of World War I by the victorious powers, three groups that never have had a history of sharing, much less of common cooperation. And there's no way we can dose them with democracy and say, good job, let's go home. They have to develop a kind of democracy that fits their culture, their needs, and their divergent beliefs. And our American political figures are often socially isolated. They don't have the need, the desire, the interest, because they don't have the understanding of the need to understand what the other cultures that we interact with are really about, and hence how to work with them. So unfortunately, for half a century or more, the United States has been self-condemned by its leadership to taking on tasks that are simply inappropriate, wrongly framed, or wrongly put into a tentative operation. Democracy has to be tailored to the culture. That's a delightful term, that social entrepreneurship. I wish I had coined it. I wonder who did. It's just marvelous. I think that leadership has become one of those words that's been abused, as if there were a single thing, leadership, and all we have to do is dress you up in it and teach you, train you, and so forth, and you're ready to go off and become a leader. I think it's altogether different domains and different areas. Albert Einstein was certainly the leading physicist in the world for half a century or more, and I don't think he ever stood out, waved a flag, and had people marching behind him. His leadership was within an extremely important community, and it was essentially almost totally intellectual. It wasn't action. On the other hand, you have a man like Ralph Nader, who saw some pretty miserable things in our society that were gratuitously miserable, like the conditions of automobiles. And he campaigned, propagandized. Propaganda, by the way, is not a bad word. It doesn't mean lying. He convinced people that there was a range of alternatives to those defective vehicles. He organized them. He then showed them how to further organize, how to become a collective or group power to bring about change, and how to have the time and the patience and use all the resources at your disposal, including the law itself, to force change. Einstein never had to force anything. Nader had to teach people how to force and make things acceptable. Leadership in the business community is an entirely different thing. How do you start a business? How do you get the resources? What's your product or your service going to be? It's a different universe. So I think that we need to recognize that leadership is not one thing, and followership is not the complement to it. But that leadership takes on many different forms and requires many different skills, depending on the area that you're in. Now, looking at the social leadership, it conjures up the notion of, again, now an antiquated term, social engineering. How do we rebuild the society in ways that will make everybody satisfied, happy, comfortable, etc.? We don't know how to do that. If we knew how to do it, it would already have been done. And I think that has to be one of the enormously open exploratory areas. And probably the goal of the social entrepreneurship should be in setting up the appropriate experiments, being sure that they're done, and being sure that when the experiment is completed, you can either say, enough of that, it didn't work, let's leave it, or now we have to propagate this to other environments, other situations. I would take the notion of social leadership to be a claim for new kinds of social, that is institutional and organizational innovation, and the whole package of running them as tests and moving ahead, either to discard something or to adopt something more universally. But I think just a marvelous term. Give it a big play. But again, sure, but not for all our leaders. I don't necessarily see that as a central factor in the leadership of the guy who runs Acme Gadgets Incorporated. He's got a problem of workforce, of research and development, of management, of dealing with suppliers and customers, but he doesn't necessarily have to be engaged in the social leadership issue, although he might be. But again, the problem for social leaders is to inform, educate, and if necessary, as it often will be, force upon him doing something. You know, the rights of women workers, the rights of minority workers, the proper role of immigrants, the notion of payment, holidays, leave, benefits, and so on. Now, a person who heads an organization might be totally resistant, and you have to break him in some literal sense, break him in order to get these things. In other cases, it might be a matter of just education and informing him, getting him to experiment, getting to see how it changes the attitudes of the staff. But the amount of that goes on is a function of the industry, the service, the company, the manufacturing company. It's a question of size. A company of 100 people versus one of 100,000 is not going to be the same game. The 100-person company can be an enormous amount better, or it can be incredibly horrible. And all of that has to be taken into account. There's no single social message of that sort. I think we need to hang a time on that. Most of my thinking is in the 20 to 30-year time frame. Why? Because that's how long, 15 to 30 years is about how long it takes any innovation to actually become practical and significantly used in a society. So 20 to 30 years or anything in between is interesting. Some of our work goes out 50 years. I have one group I work with on 1,000 years. I have another group, company I work with on 100 years. But 20 to 30 or 40 is a good common number. Now, what are the issues? I think some of the issues have to be very high in terms of risk. And the single most important human-generated risk is no longer nuclear weapons and nuclear power. That's still extremely important to pay attention to, because as more and more countries acquire the weapons, whether they acquire 2 of them or 200 of them, that increases in some sense the risk that there may be something like the initiation of World War I. All of World War I came together of no purpose, but just one thing following another, and it was a horrible event. So that's still there, but that's now been superseded by the single largest problem we face is greenhouse warming as a result of the introduction of massive amounts of fossil fuels into the atmosphere. Fossil fuels are carbon-based fuels, so it's petroleum, natural gas, anything that's woody, and anything that has carbon in it. That's all a consequence of industrialization. It's a consequence of the rise in income, the consequence of more people having more things that required energy to operate. It's a consequence of 50 to 100 years of accumulated competence, capabilities, devices, and desires. And so throttling that back, an absolute immediate in my book is 5 to 10 years, immediate stopping of the growth is the major issue. And it doesn't look good. In the United States, we have a Congress and a president who act like they were semi-illiterate boobs, into constant denial that there's a serious problem, catering to the old line high guard that supports them, namely business, particularly the petroleum, the automobile, the big producers and users. And what we have is an administration, and it isn't just the current one, but we've had a series of administrations which operate in a world of denial. And so in some sense, maybe it's even more important that we are governed not just in the U.S., but in the other major countries, in Europe and China and Russia. We're governed by people who seem to be intractably and calculatedly self-ignorant. They're into what comes out of the bereavement literature. They're into massive denial. Now that may be the really bigger problem, because they're the people with the hands on the levers. Now, I think a third problem, and the period of it is much more indeterminate, but since you said big problem, it's something celestial. A good size meteorite, good size, a mile to 10 or 15 miles in diameter hitting, that would be an event beyond any imagined excitement we've ever known. On the other hand, there are other celestial events that could occur. A star exploding as a new kind of supernova, emitting enormous amounts of dangerous radiation, and in turn affecting our own atmospheric shield. That would be something unprecedented. Then when we go beyond that, nature's very wily. All those other things out there are constantly looking for survival and propagation. And the matter of perhaps most imminent importance to us is the little guys who may cause infectious diseases. A new world pandemic, pan being in this case meaning everywhere, and everywhere epidemic, and one 10 times worse than the one in 1919 around World War I, is fully practically realized. But remember, they're not all just after us. Worldwide crop failure. Right now, for example, there's an extreme biological attack by these little animals, this case fungi, on bananas. Bananas, I think, are the 5th most important foodstuff in the world. And it's so serious now, you may not know, but the banana that you have probably eaten in the last week is an entirely different strain from the one that you've been eating for the last 25 years. The one you've been eating is under attack and is rapidly being replaced by one of the many other known varieties. So that's a sampler of the things that would have the maximum amount of effect and are plausible to think about in here in the United States or here in country X where I come from, because the problem is the same. Worldwide leadership is in some very, very literal sense a myth. The United Nations, which you'd expect to be the worldwide leaders, are just like the situation in any multi-provincial country or multi-state country of my own. They're caught up in all kinds of petty local parochial issues. The former Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, a man named Tip O'Neill, Tip I presume being short for Timothy, Tip O'Neill, who was one of our leading elected political officials, said, "All politics is local." Don't ever forget that. All politics is local. And when we see problems that are global, the one thing that's absolutely essential, without falsification, what's absolutely essential is to show the extent, realistically, of how that problem relates to the local situation. Notice I use the word situation, not the ambiguous one, local environment. Here we're not talking just about weather and climate, but jobs, health, opportunities, education, globalization, engaging in international commerce. These issues, if they can be brought back, as Tip O'Neill's implicit advice is, what does it mean to me, John Q. Public, then you have some hope of building a constituency. The least effective way of doing it is always, I find it extremely offensive, is the advocates, the people concerned about some specific issue, engage in relentless hyperbole. They overstate, they over-exaggerate, and you pretty soon get sick of that. The end of the world is not coming because of this, that, the other, and 25 other environmental insults. One needs to get a sense of proportion and so on. But the people who would want to move us in new directions, particularly in global issues, have to get Tip O'Neill's implied statement. You've got to tell me how it's going to affect people like me, communities like mine, the place where I live, the job that I have, the things I honor. And that's difficult to do because the issues arise here. The exhaustive automobiles are here. I don't give a hoot about what it is in Paris or London or any other place because it doesn't affect me. But, well, that can't be quite true now. I think it's both amusing and interesting and an important social situation in China today as we approach the Olympics. They're going to try to, in a 5 or 10 day period, clean up the worst atmospheric environment that the globe has ever had on a large scale and clean it up in 10 days to play a game so people can breathe, and then when the games are over, back to the hellhole that it was. I mean, that's in some sense, it's so bizarre that it's almost laughable. But anyway, that's a long-winded response, maybe because the problem is so large. I better not respond proportionate to the size of the problem. I don't know, I could be romantic and say, back to the neighborhood in Brooklyn, but that kind of romancing the past, I think, is inappropriate. The world is going to enormously change in the next half century, and the choices of really excellent, superb, marvelous places to live are going to be so numerous that it might be, in some sense, less the place and more the desired characteristics one is looking for. For example, I speak English. I don't speak any other language. I don't plan to learn any other language. There are millions of people like me, and we would want to probably inhabit an English-speaking community. Other people who would find that ridiculous, they would want the encounters about having to cope with French or Mongolian or cope with Paraguayan. But for me, it would be something that was comfortable with my language. And so when you look at that and look out 50 years, but use today's categories, it would probably be in some derivative of the United Kingdom, one of the former colonies, one of the spin-off countries. Canada would be an interesting first choice. Second choice, airfare quite high. Australia or New Zealand or both. And they're all great places. I spent a tourist visit to New Zealand, to New Zealand, and really am enthusiastic to find an excuse to go back. Same thing with Australia. I'm somewhat familiar with Canada since I've been in and out of it numerous times. But the English-speaking stuff would be important. But now, think further about that. English is going to be the functioning universal language. But the functioning of it is going to be more and more in trade, commerce, and business, and less, and it'll continue to grow, but it'll be far behind in the general social language, the things that relate most intimately to people. So I'm still hooked on this former British colonies. Now that opens up, of course, a large part of Africa. It opens up India, and as an incidental point, 50 years in language, we're already beginning to see the development of dialects. It's interesting for us as Americans to talk to Indians, Asian Indians. You have to reset all the dials phonetically upstairs, and I find it takes 3 or 4 minutes to get all the vowel changes under control before you can understand what's being said. Of course, that's obviously not universal, but it's a problem of the development of dialects, and English is going to become the parent of a large number of dialects. So once you get outside that, there are going to be lots and lots of good places. But keep in mind, the other thing that's happening is the presence of political map with all the multicolored countries on it is likely to undergo some very substantial changes. Western Europe, for example, is now only part of Europe, and that size of Europe is going to expand, and Europe itself is going to follow, like it or not, the track that America has already pioneered of people not saying, I'm Portuguese, I'm German, I'm French. I already hear it, it's interesting. I'm a European. I'm a European. And as those eastern barriers drop, as more and more countries enter into the European Union, and there's more free trade and free travel, I would hope and really expect that people will stop being French or German or Belgian or Italian, and they'll identify themselves as European. In fact, I heard somebody yesterday here at the meeting refer to himself as European. So that's going to change the map of what people will be comfortable with. What language will dominate? I would say it's a 50-50 bet that almost all of what's now Europe will be bilingual, with a fading original language and an increasingly adopted English. I'm amazed, for example, with my German clients, I can't always tell whether they are English native speakers or Germans. The only thing I can tell is whether they're educated in American or British English. That still comes up. But then further down, political factors may have a strain on your choices. For example, I see pressures from the globalizing world and the emerging new big powers to apply the squeeze pressure, variety of forms, to the now dominant advanced nations. And that pressure and squeeze may create a number of special problems and opportunities. The most interesting one, I think, because I haven't heard anybody talk about it, is a worldwide English union. You can picture a union of New Zealand, Australia, several black republics in Africa, the UK, US, Canada, and a sprinkling of others, forming effectively a global band ring around the world, favoring themselves in commerce. See, globalization is unstoppable. similar possibilities in other places. Let me give you a specific New Zealand illustration of the politics are local, even if the issue is global. A decade or more ago, the Japanese companies got so concerned about the problem of environmental pollution and what that would do to their industry that they began in Japan to remanufacture cars. That is, after you've had your car for 4 or 5 or 6 years, send it back to the factory or to the designated place, and they would put it in tip-top original condition. It happened in the boom in the Japanese economy, and the Japanese, as all people who are swimming in money, they don't want that remanufactured car. So the Japanese decided they would export them. And the effect on New Zealand was quite interesting. It essentially wiped out the new car market and the used car market because let's say, I don't know what the actual numbers were, but let's say a 30 to 40% discounted Japanese car was better than anything you could import new, and would be far better than trying to fiddle around with making an already wreck into working condition. Now, here's something that was undertaken as a global effort by one country to get rid of its surplus remanufactured cars, but the effect in New Zealand was absolutely totally local in wiping out effectively two normally important but kind of small at the local level businesses. If they can learn two things, they can learn first where New Zealand is and where Old Zealand is. I think New Zealand is such a lovely place with its 2 islands and so on, and the way it's settled into becoming a beautifully stable country compared to so many others, and the relatively successful, because nobody has been absolutely successful in integrating the Maoris, the indigenous people, into the society. All of that are big pluses. But I remember the last time we were there, my wife and I, just doing nothing but hanging around past a golf course, and there were a whole bunch of people who looked like they just popped out of 1920. Literally, they could have been a movie set. And they were happily going about pursuing their personal entertainment. It seems to me that it's a society that I would best describe or characterize with one word: equanimity. Now, they may not need to redo their constitution. As I mentioned earlier, constitutions have to be culturally fitting, and there's a pretty fair bet that they have a set of laws, rules, regulations, and pieces of constitution that are fitting to their very stable and very fine society. So, not everything is for everyone. But remember, the whole nature of a constitution is a safeguard. The basic thing in almost every worthwhile constitution is constraints on abuse of you. And then the second big thing, which always comes later, is the question of opening up opportunities for you. You may not do this to blacks, you may not do that to women, you may not do this to the handicapped. In other words, you may not constrain them in ways that lots and lots of people would like to. You open the door. So those two things of guarding against the evil that can be done to you and opening the opportunities for you may in some sense not be an absolutely central concern in New Zealand. I would be surprised if it was. But anyway, they'll work it out. The book that you so nicely showed, let me wave it at the viewers again. There it is. The book is truly a futures activity. I looked at the last 50 to 60 years of developments in the United States and said, what are the big changes that have occurred? And how have those changes now not come to a culmination, they're still mostly operating, but how have they changed the society now? And then how has that affected the applicability, the appropriateness of the Bill of Rights that we now have? I concentrated on the Bill of Rights. And we found enough shortfalls, enough new developments, that I propose not scrapping the present Bill of Rights, but rather complementing it with what I saw to be 10 new bills. And my goal, of course, is not to say this is God's will or I'm so smart I can tell you exactly what we must do, but really to initiate a broad-scale public discussion of this, because I've presented a coherent, organized discussion of a set of changes and a proposal to deal with it. Let me illustrate with one of them. The family has tremendously changed in the United States in whatever time frame you want, 25 years, 50 years, 120 years, but 50 or 60 was mine. And to a large extent, that's due to urbanization. Urban living is different from small town and open farmland living because you're constrained physically. In contrast with a small town environment or a rural environment, you have lots and lots of relatives, and presumably friends and associates that love you, like you, tolerate you, or you've worked mutually with. One hand washes the other when you need to. But when you get to the urban status, homes, houses, apartments are constrained. You don't have that linkage, and therefore you have to engage in an entirely different lifestyle. You have to become more atomic rather than molecular. Having lots and lots of connections, a molecular or a networked family, you become an atomic family, a single small group. So how do you compensate for all the needs that you have in a normal life? You have needs of insurance, need for health, need for care, need for education. You even have a need for children because they're so lovable. But the scale shifts and the opportunities change. Health services and so on become institutionalized in institutions that serve you. They become governmental in government agencies that work with you. Your old age becomes a matter of a thing called insured Social Security. So urban living has radically altered the structure and the function and the role of the family, and we've built institutions to meet that. But coming along with that, they all reflect the concept of family that was characteristic of colonial America. And that colonial America was characterized by being basically British Protestants. And then along came a second thing to influence the colonists who rebelled and established our country, and that was the most educated and sophisticated of them were entranced by the Enlightenment. The Enlightenment, which of course celebrated individuality, human confidence, human initiative, and so on. And so you had these driving the sense of the family into the law, with that rural family being the conceptual model. So with the passage of decades and then a couple of centuries, you see that it's dissonant. Now it isn't just dissonant with this business of health, but it's also dissonant because the city opens up to people the way no other change does, except possibly being in military service. A world that's so different from the one you came from that you either are repelled by some of it or you're entranced by others. And that has the enormous effect of changing sexual behavior. We've increasingly moved, particularly in the last 50 years, but drastically in the last 30, to separating sex from creation. Sex becomes more and more recreation rather than procreation. And in a world in which procreation dominates sexual activity, what do you do about it? You have a growth, for lack of a better term, and without any disrespect, that refer to as proto-families, copying families, simulated families. You have people shacking up. You have people in trial marriages. You have people engaged in homosexual rather than heterosexual liaisons. You have even people in polygamy. Now, all of our laws are reflected around the colonial family. What do you do about the increasing percent of the families that are in these non-traditional arrangements? Is it proper to leave them out of the game? No. Is it popular to say these other things that go on quite successfully in other parts of the world should never be counted as legitimate? So the first of my proposed Bills of Rights has to do with restructuring the family as the unit to receive public and organizational and corporate benefits that all these other forms are entitled to be drawn in, just because you're living with your boyfriend as you decide whether you really want to get married. Should you, if you get an infectious disease, be sent to the poorhouse to die? Now, why should you be treated disparagingly? We'll throw you in jail if you're a polygamist. Polygamy, there's not anything except anti-Christian hostility that argues against polygamy. It's practiced around the world on at least 2 continents, and it's integrated into Islam, and it's integrated into African families. Well, they're different than ours. Of course they're different than ours. But don't accuse polygamy of intrinsically being bad or disruptive. Look at the positive sides of it where it exists. And those people are being victimized because almost all federal legislation or state legislation dealing with family structure is based on the Christian beliefs of 200 years ago. In case you didn't know this, that's a violation of the First Amendment. That's supporting a church, in this case a cluster of Christian churches, and a society which is also at the same time increasingly becoming secular rather than strongly religious oriented. So that's a little description of one of the origins of one of our proposed new bills in the Bill of Rights. If you think about it, and you don't even have to think very long, you can go to a reference book about it, almost all of American and Anglo-Saxon privacy, which of course is the underpinning of American sense of privacy, come out of property rights. They don't come out of a world of information, they come out of the world of property. These are the boundaries on my property, and you dare not cross those boundaries without my permission, because I don't want you going into my barn, I don't want you releasing my animals, I don't want you looking in my window. That line is my property, and it's verboten to cross it over. And so all the legislation and all of the rights notions about privacy basically flow in one way or another out of property issues. But now with the movement from a world in which property was in some sense the single mark of great success, your property may be just one house, your property may be a 500-acre farm, but the property was what made you a real citizen. In fact, voting rights were often tied to property. But now in a world in which information and information managing apparatus and gadgets has become dominant in our lives, in our private lives, and in our commercial lives, we find that all of this stuff squeezed out of, distorted, twisted, and so on, out of property issues, just can't hack it. And so we're in some sense, a politico-intellectual crisis. What exactly is privacy? What is it that you're not entitled to know about me, or to try to find out, or to squeeze out of me? That's not an easy question. See, if I'm your banker, I darn well have to know whether you're employable for the future. On the other hand, if I'm your doctor and I need to consult you, I've got to know what's wrong with you for my consultation. On the other hand, if you broke both legs and you'll never run again, I've got to know some things about you as an employer and about somebody who's trying to help you get work. But information so permeates the society that it's hard to define the boundaries. In fact, I've enumerated 11 different forms of privacy just to help shape the question of what might be generalizable out of all of that. On the other hand, do you have a right to be shielded from information? Every day I get at least 2 fresh internet overtures to enhance my penis in those bold languages. I get now an average of 2 a day to see nude total body photographs of Hollywood stars. I get messages probably at least once a day from, I'm a very nice girl, but I'm lonely. I can only imagine one thing. See, my early morning screen is filled with stuff that I want to be protected from. Not because I have some moral indisposition to what they're selling, but because it's just a nuisance. It takes me a measurable amount of time to purge that stuff every morning. So, do I have a right, so to speak, to silence? Does that guy down there with the loudspeaker trying to get me to vote for Adam Smith or John Wells or whatever, does he have a right to blare that at me through an amplifier, or do I have a right to privacy? He has a right to free speech, but does he also have a right to a megaphone? I have a right, but it's one of my rights to be sheltered from him. So the information world has created this whole new wave of situations, and the concerns are real and by no means fully satisfied. I have a bill in my proposed Bill of Rights dealing with that too, but let me not bore you with the details. The point is that it's a book put together thoroughly with a perspective on the future. Yeah, I think that it would be very foolish public policy to isolate New Zealand because with each passing decade it would fall farther and farther behind and become, in some literal sense, decrepit, simply because it couldn't keep up with the things it probably like to. I think the central problem for New Zealand is, in a globalizing world, what products or services does it have to offer? One of the interesting things is the state of Massachusetts here in the U.S. has an interesting thing to offer to the world. Superbly educated people. They come and they go. Half of the graduate students, I think, in U.S. primary universities are foreigners, here to become better than they could be at home and go back and become significant there. So what is it that you could offer by way of services? New Zealand is a lovely place. Could it build an important base, as the Parisians have, in tourism? Some fabulous number of people go to, and an incredible number actually go up to the top of the Eiffel Tower. They love the city, they enjoy what's there. Tourism is going to become more and more a worldwide moneymaker, because the universal is that as income increases, real income increases, people want 3 things. The first thing that they want is more meat in their diet. The second thing they want is motorized transportation. And the third thing they want is internet access. And the fourth thing they want is to visit more of the world. So I think that it certainly isn't going to go in the business of manufacturing all automobiles or whatever. It doesn't have to go into the dirty jobs, but I think it has to integrate into the global economy by offering something special. Now, there are other considerations, and I know absolutely zero about it. I don't know anything about the off-ocean topography. I don't know whether there are any oil or gas reserves there. But if I were in the New Zealand government, I would sure want to get an answer to that question in the next couple of years, because it's a drilling issue, it's a geological issue, and so on, because that could be, for an extended period of time, bonanza time in New Zealand. But what is there off that shore? But globalization is the key.